Good morning, everyone. This sounds like a happy group this morning. I'm glad that everybody's lively. My name is Anne Hanley, and I'm the playwright of the Winter Bear. And we're not going to do exactly what the workshop description says, so if you're worried about getting called upon to come up with a story or something like that, we're not going to call on you that way, although we're hoping for participation in other ways. So the first thing I'd like to do is introduce our moderator, Brianne Westcott. And that's Brianne, which is spelled like Brian, except there's this tiny little accent over the I. And so it's pronounced Brian, the Celtic way. And that reflects his father's Celtic heritage, Irish and Scotch, or just Scotch. And his mother's Yupik heritage is reflected in his Yupik name, which is Bugga. Thank you. So Brian hails from Fairbanks, where he grew up. His father was a professor at the Geophysical Institute in Fairbanks, and Brian's mother, his father was Eugene Westcott, who passed away a few years ago. His mother is Elizabeth Parent, and she was the first Alaska Native female PhD. And Brian continued the history of educational excellence. He was graduated from Harvard. He received a PhD from Yale in American Studies, and his thesis was on Native American theater. Brian now divides his time between LA and Alaska, but his cat lives in LA, so I think that that means his real actual home is LA. He's a member of the Screen Actors Guild, the Writers Guild, and Actors Equity. He's been in many films, in front of the camera, producing, writing, behind the camera. You might have recently seen him in William Inc. that was recently here in Anchorage at the PAC, produced by Perseverance Theater. And you might most recently have seen him last night or the night before as Sidney Huntington in The Winter Bear. So, Brian, fill it out. Sorry.
All right, I am officially embarrassed. Thank you for that introduction, Anne. Yes, my name is Brian. I'm moderating today. I'm going to introduce a very fine panel of other folks who are involved with the Winter Bear Project as well, which we offer to you as one example of how to encourage people to tell their own story. That's the core of any kind of healing work, any kind of therapy, any kind of community building, is getting people to reclaim their voice, their power, and tell their story. When people can speak, they can narrate a better ending than we have currently, right? That's what we want. So I'll just go along the table here so you can see. At the end of the table is my friend and several-time collaborator, Tom Robenolt. He's a freelance actor and director based in New York City. He's worked with Perseverance Theater a number of times, but I also worked with him with the Fairbanks Shakespeare Theater on an Alaskan adaptation of A Midsummer Night's Dream. That was really fun to do. He's got a long, long list of actor credits, which I'm happy to share with you and embarrass him after. And he was just our director and our tour manager for a tour that we just completed in the Arctic Circle and also to Tyonek and ending in Anchorage. Two spaces to my left, of course, is our playwright and head of the Winter Bear Project, Anne Hanley, whom I've known for, I don't know when it was several years before you wrote The Winter Bear. I remember it was in development. I remember sitting in her office when it just seemed hopeless. Nobody was ever going to sign on. I just said, keep going, one foot in front of the other. Somebody will be that first entity to sign up, and then it will be much easier for other entities or people to sign on, and they did. And if we did it, you can do it too. And immediately to my left is someone, it is our great honor to have one of the daughters of Sidney Huntington himself, Annie Huntington-Kriska, who is currently grant advisor for the South Central Foundation Behavioral Health Office. And she has been at the forefront of rural Alaska community developments at the local, state, and national levels for almost 50 years. So not only a Huntington, but also a very respected community organizer, Annie Huntington-Kriska. Alrighty, so, Anne, why don't we start with you? Tell us how you became involved with the Winter Bear Project. How did it come to you?
Okay, well, we wanted to start by just kind of telling our own stories. So I'll tell my story of how I got started with the Winter Bear, but I have to go back a little further. I made some notes, and that's not because I don't know my own story. It's because I usually forget half of what I'm going to say, so I had to have some notes. My husband and I came to Alaska in 1976. I was a city girl, born in Boston. I lived in Washington, D.C., in L.A., and San Francisco. So I was way out of my element coming to Alaska, but very excited about it. My husband and I planned to stay for 1 year, as most people who move here do, and a 1 year interlude, and then we would go back to our real life. Here I am, still here today. I wanted to tell you just a little story about the first time that Alaska really knocked me off my high horse. I went to work when I first came for the TV station in Fairbanks, and it was during the pipeline era, and they sent me down to Juneau to do some kind of a story. I forget what it was even. But I was waiting in line at Alaska Airlines to come back to Fairbanks, and there was this man in front of me, and he just looked very derelict. He had on an old ripped pair of Carhartts and one of those terrible baseball caps that you couldn't read the writing on anymore, dirty boots, and he was fumbling around taking out these pieces of machinery and putting them on the counter to be looked at. Security back then was very rudimentary. And I just thought to myself, why did I come here, in this place with these uncool people? And just at that moment, the woman who was handling security looked up at this man and she said, "Good morning, Governor Hammond. We're so pleased to have you on Alaska Airlines." And the people who are from Alaska know that Governor Jay Hammond was at that time the sitting governor of Alaska. And he was also a bush pilot and a fisherman. So he was bringing airplane parts along with grapefruit back in this bag. So I learned my big lesson about Alaska right at that point, which is people in Alaska are always more than they seem. And that lesson has kind of carried me through many, many other parts of what's gone on in my life. So when I first came to Alaska, I decided that I really needed to read everything I possibly could. So about Alaska, because that was my way. I was a liberal arts college Eastern graduate, so you read everything you could. And there were 3 books that really knocked my socks off. That's the only way I can think of to explain it. The first one was called The Gospel According to Peter John, Chief Peter John. Chief Peter John was alive at that time. He was very old. He now the Tanana Chiefs Conference building in Fairbanks is named after him. But he wrote a book, and in the book, he just turned me around with things he said. He said, everything is alive. Everything. The birds, the animals, the earth, the rivers. And the way he put it, I had never thought about that. I guess I knew it in my heart of hearts, I felt it. But he said it. He articulated that deep Athabascan belief. And I'm no expert on Athabascan philosophy, but that's what I took to heart about his book. So if you ever want to read a great book, I would recommend that. The second book that really interested me was by an anthropologist named Richard Nelson. It was called Hunters of the Northern Ice. And it was about Catherine Atla and her husband, who lived in Heaslea, and how they went about their subsistence activities. And one thing that it amplified from the Gospel according to Peter John was, if everything is alive, then the wilderness outside is more sacred than anything inside. And it's what's important. And we have to live in the world out there with reverence. And Catherine and her husband just went about all of their tasks, their subsistence tasks, with reverence. And that was a new concept for me. So the third book that made a huge impression on me was Shadows on the Koyukuk by Sidney Huntington. And that impressed me because Sidney, I had no idea how hard it was to live in the old ways in Alaska in those days. And Sidney's stories just about having to take care of his little brother and his sister when he was 5 years old because their mother had died. They had to wait for someone to come rescue them. I mean, the rest of his life must have been easy compared to that. So it made a huge impression on me. And when anyone asked me about a book to read about Alaska, you know, because they were coming or whatever, I always told them to read that book. So one day, I'm listening to the radio, and there's two young men on the radio, and they are saying that they want to do something about a rash of suicides that had been just taken place in Fairbanks of Native young people, mostly from the Arctic Village area, and one of these young men was from that area. So they decided to do things on their own. They formed an organization called Dena'ina, and they did stuff like, stuff they came up with, like they would do rap at dances and talk about how much young people had to live for in their own language. And so they wanted to do more, and they had a little meeting. And Mark Frank, one of the young men, had just read the Shadows on the Koyukuk. And so he decided that it would be a great idea to do a play about Sidney Huntington, because reading the book, he was struck by how similar the things were that happened to Sidney that were happening now. You know, the same stresses and the same inappropriate responses that were available to people to those things. So we thought it would be a great idea to do a play, and actually had received a small grant to do it, and I suspect Annie might be having more to say about that. So I listened to the show, and afterwards I called them up and I said, who's going to write this play? And they said, oh, we don't know. You know, we were thinking we'd all get together and we'd write it and we'd do skits. And I said, please, please, give me a crack at writing the play. So these 20-something young men, Matt Stevens, who's now a very eminent videographer at South Central Foundation, and Mark Frank, Matt Stevens, I'm sorry, they let me try this. And I give them a lot of credit for allowing an old lady who wasn't even native to do this. So there was a small amount of money in the grant that was allocated for me to come up and spend some time in Sydney. So I did that, and I'd actually written a script because I was supposed to go up to see Sidney, but then things came up. He was sick, his daughter couldn't go with me, I had stuff going on. So I didn't get up to Galena, where he lived, to talk to him until I had written the script. But I really wanted to talk to him. So I went into his house, and it was the log house that he himself built in Galena. And unfortunately, that house has been destroyed in the flood that happened a few years ago. So I'm sitting there, and Sidney is sitting in front of a wall of pictures of his children. Now, Sidney had 20 children, so it was a very crowded wall. There were some grandchildren on there, too. So I was very nervous, and to break the ice with him, I asked him to tell me about his children. So he was pointing the children out in the pictures, and he came to a picture of a handsome young man in a wolf skin parka, tall, like he was. Had been, he wasn't tall when I met him, he was older. But this young man was at the head of a dog team. And I asked him, you know, who is this son? And all of a sudden, there were tears in his eyes, and then there were tears rolling down his cheeks. Now, I had been told what to expect with Sidney Huntington. He was, as many people described him, a tough old man. And be prepared to have him dress you down and, you know, use his caustic sense of humor on you. And I was prepared, kind of, for those things. I was not prepared for tears. So because I couldn't think of anything else to do, I just waited. And he collected himself, and he pointed out 2 more of his sons who had committed suicide. And then we both cried. And his daughter, Betty, was translating for me. Now, Sidney's English was perfect, but he was very hard of hearing at that point, which I think was due to a life of being around boats and chainsaws and mining equipment. So Betty would, you know, have to kind of yell the questions to him, "Dad," you know, and he would reply. And finally, I started writing out questions. Anyway, Betty said he had never talked about suicide like that before with anyone in the family that she knew of, or anyone. So I went back to the bed and breakfast that was owned by another Huntington sister, Agnes. And I didn't sleep at all that night. I just tossed and turned, and I said, why me? You know, I'm not even native. I'm a stranger. Why would he open up to me? So the next day, I went back to him, and I said, what would you think if I wrote a play that talked about some of the things we talked about your children who had committed suicide, your father, about some of the thoughts that you'd had about suicide? And he looked at me, and he said, well, do you think that would do any good? And I honestly had to say to him, I don't know. And then he replied right away, and he said, if you think it would help even one kid, go for it. And so that's what I did. I wrote a play about a young man who was mentored by Sidney, because Sidney did mentor many young people in his life, so that wasn't a big stretch. And the teenager was planning to commit suicide until Sidney turned him around using traditional love and tough love and traditional culture, and they worked together to hunt a winter bear. So from about 2010 to 2016, I produced this play. We formed a little nonprofit, the Winter Bear Project, and we brought this play all over Alaska. To date, over 10,000 Alaskans have seen this show, most with their neighbors in their own communities. And during that time, we've danced and sang and played theater games with thousands of students. We've sampled moose, bear, caribou, salmon, seal, whale, lots of Jell-O at community potlucks, where lots of generous people have shared their stories, and we've learned to live with those stories. So all I can say to sum up is that it must be a huge thrill to have a show open on Broadway for a playwright. I don't think I'm ever going to have that thrill. But for me, nothing compares with the kind of intake of breath that comes from an audience in a drafty school gym somewhere in rural Alaska, when they realize that this story is about them and when they realize that this story has something to do with their stories. And after that intake of breath, before that they've been kind of, maybe a little fidgety, like what do they do getting into a play? How are they going to sit there, all the things that go on in people's lives. But after that intake of breath, it's quiet, and they start listening. And that's when I know the power of story has taken over. And I realize that that power connects us on a very deep level, that they are listening on a deep level. They're listening with their own experience. So that's as much as I want to say about my story.
Great. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Anne. I'm going to turn it now over to Annie, and then we'll get to you, Tom. Annie, obviously you are one of the beloved children of Sydney, and it is a great honor for all of us to help tell a version of Sydney's story and share it with the state of Alaska, but you can tell it from your experience. This is your life. Tell us how suicide influenced your father's life, you, your family. What's it like to share this with other people?
Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Annie, for sharing your story. Well, I actually could start my story when I was a child, sexually abused and physically abused, but we would be here all day and all night. I could start my story when I lost my first brother to suicide. He came back from Vietnam, and it's like he was never with us again. Or I could start my story when I lost about my fifth nephew in about 1999. Or I could start my story when I first met Matthew Stevens and Mark Frank, when they came to me when I was the Deputy Director of Fairbanks Native Association, and humbly asked me to introduce them to my dad, because they wanted to share his story through play. They had already contacted Anne and got the grant. They wanted to share his story around the world if they could, about how strong our culture is and how resilient our people are because of that culture. Or I could start my story when I experienced my own suicide ideation, thoughts of committing suicide when I was deeply into alcohol many years ago. Or I could just start my story as a grants advisor now, which I've been for about 1.5 years with South Central Foundation, where I have come full circle, just about, with my work in suicide prevention. I've worked with my sister Agnes Sweetser, who lives in Galena currently, for many years, trying to help to prevent suicide. I remember 1999 when I was hired by the University of Alaska to develop a tribal management program. And I needed to go to Colorado to close up my office there because that's where I had planned to stay. I was working with the Hopi and the Navajo and several other tribes on community development, because that's my background, is to help people with develop programs. So I went over to Colorado to close up my office and ship everything back to Alaska, because the president of the university wanted me to develop this tribal management program. And it was there my sister called me. I hadn't planned to return to Alaska for a few days yet. It was a holiday weekend. But she called me and she said, "We lost the number one." That was the night. One. evacuation of 5 villages within the past 6 months. 9 young people within the past 6 months. It blew me away. I cried, I hollered, I was by myself in Evergreen, Colorado. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? I grabbed a telephone book. This is before cell phone. Grabbed a telephone book, or at least before I owned one. Grabbed a telephone book and just started going through that telephone book. Yellow pages. I need somebody. I need somebody. You know how at home we just go to one another when we lose somebody. We just go to one another. I needed somebody. Went through that telephone book just crying. Calling this one and that one and this number and that number. And I ended up calling this phone number. They're a little ways away in Boulder. I called them. It was weekend, holiday weekend. They answered, this young girl answered the phone. And I told her my situation. I just said, I need somebody. I don't need a mental health counselor or anything like that. I need somebody. Come to us, she said. So I got dressed and drove to Boulder, to the Triad Center. And in the meantime, this young girl got the team together. Barbara Plestad, Pamela Jeffer-Thurman, and several other folks who had worked on and developed a community readiness plan, which some of you probably know about. It's very well known now, a way to gather the community, to work with the community around an issue. They were a godsend. God helped definitely brought me to that phone number. And I went to them and I spent the whole day with them, spent the next day with them, figuring out a way how they could come to my home to help us. And that's when I became deeply involved in suicide prevention. And over the years, I've worked in many organizations, executive director, deputy director, community planner, organizational manager, trainee, trainer, and all over the world since then. But I always came back somehow to suicide prevention. And when I was hired as a grants advisor by South Central Foundation about a little over a year ago, they gave me, there's 3 grants advisors and each have a set of divisions. And they gave me the Behavioral Services Division as one of my departments to be the grants advisor. And at that very same time, they needed someone to be the project director for the Garrett Lee Smith Suicide Prevention Program. And they assigned me. So I always came back to suicide prevention. And still being involved over the years with Anne, we dialogue by email all the time. She kept me in touch, as well as my sister Agnes and my sister Betty Huntington. We always kind of just stayed in tune with what was going on with the winter there. My work at South Central Foundation not only brings me full circle in terms of suicide prevention, child and sexual abuse, but it also brings me full circle to our culture, the strength of our culture, and how this play, this story, tells our story. Each and every one of us, each one of us has a story that can help another person to gravitate toward healing and toward help. Our culture is the strength and is the backbone of our story. South Central Foundation bases its process and its system on story, storytelling, the story of the people, the story of specific persons, but we base our work on story. And because we know the strength and we know the power of story for healing. And that's, like I said, I could stay here all day telling you my stories. Dad, when he wrote the book, and it finally was published, and he and I were sitting down, he said that they left out a lot of words. He said, he held his hand up like that, of course he had a bigger hand than me. He said, my stack of yellow paper, meaning the legal paper, is that thick. He said, they left out a lot of words. So his story was much longer and probably quite healing for him to write. But he definitely had a story, and I'm so pleased and proud of all of the people who have gotten involved in the Winter Bear over the years, because it really truly does not only tell Dad's story, but it tells our story as a people, not just Athabascan, not just Yupik, not just Inupiat, Tlingit, Haida, Navajo. It tells our story about our culture and the strength that it gives us. So that's me. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie, for sharing some deeply personal story with us of yourself and your family. That models what we hope to encourage everyone to do. It's okay now to get up and speak. Do what you just did. On a practical note, I want to bring this around, as you said, full circle. I do want to point out, as part of Annie's work at South Central Foundation, she curates a large suite of information and resources to help with suicide prevention. One thing that she's arranged for today is for this panel to be filmed. So there's a couple of cameras here. It's mostly on us, but we did want to let you all know that this is being recorded so that people who can't be here today can also be sharing the information. But if anyone for any reason is uncomfortable with even having their voice or the back of their head raising a question, when we're done talking, we're going to open it up to all of you. We'd be happy to chat with you after, if the camera's any kind of issue. We understand. Okay, I'm going to turn it now over to my friend Tom, who's, after all this great personal stories of people who have known Sydney Huntington, the next task was, okay, how do you turn this into a play, get it on the road, cast it with actors, and build a set, and design a tour to go to villages. There's a lot of practical things involved. This really hadn't been done before, so we just sort of figured it out as we did it. And one of the key people in doing that is Tom Robenolt. So Tom, how is it, what do you have to do to take an idea like this and actually manifest it in the real world?
It takes a lot of work. I'd say that one of the crucial things to think about if you are interested in developing something like this and taking it to like smaller communities is that you have to plan ahead. We plan about 4 months ahead, and that might even be pushing it. And a lot of this has to deal with communicating with the communities that you're going to. One thing that we really like to do is we get a community contact involved, and when you find a community contact, the great thing about that person is that you can ask them all sorts of questions. You can have them relate to you about performance spaces, even things like getting you from the airstrip to the schools if you're performing there. So there's a lot of logistics that a community contact can help you with. Another thing that we do is we email the superintendents of schools, because we perform a lot in schools. That's in the villages especially. That's probably the best place that you can find to perform a production, or if it's a storytelling event, anything like that, or the school gyms. So a smart thing is to, that Anne actually trained me on all this, is to get in touch with a superintendent, because you're starting at the top. And that way, once you see the principals on this, and when they see that and the superintendent gets back to you and says, yes, we'd love to have this story and come to our community, then the principal has to then has to communicate, which you can find sometimes is a little tricky. But it's a great way of getting people involved immediately into the communication of this project happening. And then, yeah, it's really just a lot of communicating with that community contact and with the principals. Anything from, is there Wi-Fi to school so the actors are happy, to getting plane rides and setting up travel to the villages, to getting picked up at the airstrip, and logistics on how much your set, many pieces your set is to put onto the planes, to people picking them up and taking them to the performance space, places where you're going to stay those evenings that you're there. Food, if we have to bring our own food or if food is provided. There's a ton of logistics that get involved, but I guess the main thing I can really stress is getting somebody that's in the village or in the community that really buys in, and that person makes everything so much easier. And normally you're going for somebody who's pretty well respected in the community so they can help get things done. They also help with marketing. You can send them the flyers through email, they print it out, they put it up, and that's a big deal because you can show up sometimes and although you've been talking to the principals and you've been talking to a couple of community members, you show up and no one really knows the show's going on, so you last minute are trying to get people involved. And I'd stress that marketing is a huge deal, sending them flyers and such, and then getting on the airwaves and publicizing your production. So that's a big part of it, is a bunch of logistics. I don't know how much time we have to keep spending on this.
We're good.
It's 11:09, okay. We do, yeah. So that is really the main part of getting, a production to the village. The other thing to think about is rehearsals, where you can have rehearsal space. There's a lot of work that has to be done, just even within where you're at, before you take a production to another community. And that's finding a performance space. If you have technical elements, where's a space that you can use that's big enough, that has the electronic support to have tech, so that you can add the elements of sound and lights and costumes and such into your production. Yeah, that's basically what I've got for as far as planning out and bringing to the villages.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. You can see there's a theme running through here. We're encouraging storytelling. And in terms of the practical elements, it's all about communication.
Yeah.
And what I love about this project is that a lot of different kinds of people have come together to make it happen. Non-native people and native people, which is actually a beautiful thing. That doesn't mean, oh, native people don't have the capacity to do this. Native people absolutely do, but at the moment when they needed it, those young men were looking around, well, who knows how to write a play? Here's someone who was trained in that. So actually, she was the perfect person, and you were the perfect person and you arrived at the right time to help. I also want to point out that, as Annie mentioned, our culture is the bedrock of everything. Native people in Alaska and everywhere else have epic traditions of performance and theater. They were very thoroughly stamped out, but they're still there. They've held on. They had to go underground a bit. And I know that when we do workshops with children and adults, that it's there. It isn't that hard to get it to come back out. And we hope that more and more Native people will do what I did, which is go into the performing arts fully. I've done both. I've learned indigenous traditions and also modern theater and film. so that we can circulate in the modern world as well. But if I can do it, I grew up in a little cabin at the end of a dirt road outside of Fairbanks. If I could claw my way into the business, anybody can do it. I'm nothing special that way. It's just hard work. So I just a couple of practical notes here. I want to make sure, Dina Kelly, are you in the room?
Oh.
Yes, Dina Kelly is a resource person and a care provider. So if anyone feels or knows someone who might want to talk to a care provider, this is our designated person in the room today. Please feel free to avail yourself of her. We also have information in the back on the South Central Foundation, who is one of our major sponsors, and also has arranged for this panel today. Shall we open it up? What do you think? So we would love to hear, love to know some more about you guys and some of the things you might be working on, and perhaps we can offer answers to questions, guidance on if you have an unusual idea of how to activate community involvement and help people find their own voices. We'd be happy to help you. First, a question. Who here has seen The Winter Bear? That's actually very interesting. So most of you have not.
Tickets were sold out. Yeah.
Tickets were sold out, yeah. In Anchorage, most of our touring is to schools in small villages. We did early on in 2010 and 2011 have full runs at Cyrano's Theater and at the Wildberry Theater in Anchorage. So several weeks of full houses. Those did sell out, as I recall.
Given that this is a national conference, I'm sure the people from Canada, Navajo, and California probably have been able to see it.
Right, which leads me to my next thing. Who here is from Alaska? A good number of people. Who here is from the lower 48? A good number of people. Who's here from Canada or another country? That's a pretty good, interesting mix of people. Who has worked on anything related to the performing arts? Not bad. What kinds of things do you do? The hands that just went up.
So my previous job, we actually did like a touring theater piece at schools throughout California about introducing youth to mental health. It's called Walking Our Shoes, and so we went to elementary schools, had like transition age youth, like over 18, kind of playing the teenagers to start introducing like the concept of different mental health or mental illnesses.
Oh, fantastic. We might have some notes to compare. And for those other hands, what other kinds of projects are you doing that relate in any way to performing arts or telling story? Yes?
I've posted stories and legends throughout different school systems for the last
I'll come and just make sure that I can hear you. You say you do residencies?
I said I do stories and legends of the Coast Salish people throughout different school systems down in the States. Just recently was a small part in 76 killed by the Washington Redskins.
Right.
By one of our local playwrights.
Excellent. Excellent. So we have a performer in the house. Other hands that just went up. Things related to the performing arts. And, oh, I'm sorry. Please, go ahead.
Way back here. I go to a lot of different schools, and that's northern traditional style of dance. So I teach young boys how to be warriors, how to become men, and do a lot of traditional teachings, teaching language, culture, spirituality, history. So I do that quite a bit.
Great. Thank you. Anyone else? Yes.
I'm from Winnipeg, Canada, and I did my PhD on digital storytelling and performance.
Digital storytelling, PhD.
Yeah, so I taught them how to use the editing software to be able to video about their experience and what they went through and how they stay connected to family, culture, and land.
Oh, that's fantastic. wow, teaching kids themselves to tell their stories about leaving care and becoming adults standing on their own feet. I love it. Fantastic. Anyone else? Yes.
a website about that project or anything? Because that sounds so interesting.
I don't have a website yet. I'm actually doing some other work with families. I'm doing intergenerational cultural storytelling with families who have had prior child welfare history. So they would not be involved anymore, but I wanted to know about how they were impacted by that experience and how they function now as a family that they're no longer involved.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Anyone else on that particular topic? I'm curious, who here is involved in mental health? Okay, a few hands. Who's involved in law enforcement or anything of that nature? And then what do you do?
Work for Correctional Services Canada, which is federal incarcerated inmates, and I deliver like holistic trauma-based programming to Indigenous offenders to just help them get out and live healthy lives and take care of their responsibilities the way they're supposed to. Something like that.
Healthy lives. I love it. What other kinds of things do folks in the audience do? I'm just wondering what our audience is and what your interest is so that we can maybe help you. What fields do you work in? Yes, sir.
In child welfare for litigation, child visitation, transport.
Excellent. Indian child welfare. Fantastic. Yes, ma'am.
I work at the child support office, but I have a question. What is the winter bear about? I've never heard about it.
Yeah, so this, because I should have done this sooner, but I'm gonna let you do this. For people who have not seen The Winter Bear, can you give us a summary?
Okay, so The Winter Bear is a play, and it's fiction, and it features the life of the real person, Sidney Huntington, who died when he was 100 years old in 2015, and Annie is his daughter. So the story is that there's a young boy who's committed a small crime. They think he's tried to burn down the school. But actually he was covering himself with gasoline and trying to kill himself before someone arrived and stopped him. So he was convicted by a tribal court, and his sentence was to cut wood for Sidney Huntington for a winter. So the old man wasn't thrilled to see the young boy, and the young boy wasn't thrilled to be there, but they kind of came to realize they had a shared language in hunting, because the young boy played video games, and they're all about quests and hunting and that kind of thing. And Sidney, of course, was a great hunter in his day, and trapper. So Sidney is able to give the boy some lessons that he never had, because he never had a real male in his life, except his grandfather, who played both negatively and positively into his story. So Sidney worked with the boy to teach him how to make traditional weapons, and one of the weapons they make is a bear spear. Now, bear spears hadn't been used for quite a number of years at this point. But so they make the bear spear, and through some circumstances, there is a winter bear. And winter bears, I'm told, are like the nastiest, meanest bears that could possibly be, because they want to be hibernating, they want to be asleep, and they're not. And so maybe it's a toothache that woke them up, or maybe their den got flooded out. So they are very, very feared. So a winter bear is kind of terrorizing the area, and Sidney and this boy have to go out and hunt the bear with nothing but a spear. And the boy is able to kill the bear. And in the end, the boy is able to, through his experiences with Sidney, to realize his own potential and to get out of the shadows. His nickname is Shadow. So he's able to come out of the shadows to the point where Sydney's been wounded in this encounter with the bear. The boy is able to take over and speak for Sydney at the Alaska Federation of Natives Convention, which is massive. It takes place often in this facility, Dena'ina Convention Center, only there's like 7,000 or 8,000 people.
It's the largest convention in the state of Alaska.
Yeah, it's massive. And this boy who never dared to speak out or to stand up is able to stand up and speak to this whole assemblage. So that's the story.
Yes,
Do you have
ma'am.
a video of this?
There is one clip. It's a play, so there are licensing issues, and it's not really meant to be, it's not a film yet, although that is an idea that has been floating around for a while, making a proper film. So there's a clip on winterbearproject.com. There's one scene there, and a lot of photographs of past productions and tours that we've done. So we encourage you to look there.
I'd like to just add,
Yes.
Oftentimes, especially people in schools, and they say, do you have a video? And the answer is we don't, because we haven't had the money to do a proper video. But there's a deeper reason, and that is that our goal is to connect with people in communities. And you don't connect by sending a video. Videos are nice, and maybe when we've satisfied ourselves that we have looked in the face of people in every Alaska Native village and city and town, then we'll look towards a video. It's amazing to do a play in a community and be right on the gym floor where everyone is sitting and have kids and dogs wandering around. And it's just an amazing experience that we can't duplicate with the video, but we would love to get to that if we can find the funding at some point.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm from the lower 48 Kansas, the center of the United States. Our knowledge of Alaska, we have a 66, but he left, he lives among the Pyle, Prairie Dam Pyle. He lives in the colony, that's the extent of our knowledge. And it's wonderful story, and it would be, I consider it, showing it to our young people, and then it can spur discussion. That's my thought.
Thank you. That's exactly the purpose of our doing all this work that Tom was describing, and Anne has described, and Annie have described, is to inspire others to tell their own stories. And we do it by demonstrating, and we do want to go to the lower 48. We just haven't got it together yet, but we're talking about it to do exactly what you said.
How many of you have ever been through a community planning exercise? Okay, one of the planning exercises that I often do with my groups is the whole close your eyes thing. Close your eyes and think what you would like to see, in 20 years and 10 years and so on and so forth. So about 20 years ago, I think we started this conversation, Anne and I remember doing that at that time. And my vision, this was my vision then, and it remains my vision today, and I'm going to just spread it around. And if you got the money, help me make my vision come true. And that's for to have enough money so that Tom and his crew and his, not necessarily the actors, but the design crew, the directing crew, the assistants, and can go to a reservation in the lower 48 and encourage a team of actors in your community to act out the story of maybe not the winter bear, but of another cultural horror that something may be, I can't think of one, maybe a giant wild lizard or something, or a mad snake or something, but of some cultural fear or something that is just fearful to your community, that a young man who is struggling with his own identity and vacillating between old tradition and new ways, and to tell a story, let Anne adapt a story to your culture, that so the people in your home could understand, based on the strength of your culture, your tradition, your knowledge and wisdom that comes from your people. That's my dream. That's my vision. And for people like Brian as actors to get involved, because the actors are all over the world. There may be somebody in your community that has aspirations, or local university that has a acting program, or whatever they call these kind of programs, to get involved in a project that's my vision. I closed my eyes 20-some years ago, and that's my vision for the winter bear. So think about it. If you know somebody with money, if you know somebody who owns a casino or something, plunk some money down.
Yes. Anne, you want to answer that? She asked, are we a nonprofit?
A couple of years ago, I realized producing the show was too much for me. So I turned it over to Perseverance Theater, which is Alaska's only nonprofit professional theater company. And Perseverance is now developing a wonderful program to encourage Native writers to find their voices. That's going on now. This year they produced the show that Brian was in, William Inc., as a main stage production. And they are working, this has always been part of my vision too, is to use the winter bear as a training ground for Alaska Native voices, training theater professionals, writers, and that is happening. Perseverance is doing that now. So, I think that if it just could get out to places in the lower 48, and you could see what's involved and what an impact it has, that then you would think up your own programs and your own ways to do it. Because that's part of what we do is with the Winter Bear, when we go into communities, we don't try to come up with solutions for people how they should deal with suicide prevention, because the community has to do that. We do the play. So hopefully if the funding, we can find some funding, we can build this program that Perseverance is working on and get it out there to the lower 48, to Canada. Would be wonderful.
That's part of the reason of having behavioral health specialists that come to each play, is that hopefully if you can set it up after the play's left and we bring the topic, and hopefully that starts the discussion, is that about a week later, behavioral health specialists will meet with the community and they'll start the dialogue with the community on what they can do to combat this and what their own thoughts are. So the project doesn't just begin and end when we come in and present the play. It really begins after we leave. So that's just, it's a conversation starter, and it's just the spark, hopefully, for each community to get out there. And we have talkbacks. We do workshops during the day before the show, and a lot of times you'll find people who will come out and start talking even in the workshops or during our talkbacks. Also, right before we're about to leave on the airstrip, you'll find community members who are waiting by the airplanes to tell you their own personal story. As actors and directors, we can only listen. We can't offer any advice because that's not what we do. But that's what the behavioral health specialists are there for. And it's very important to always have them there during the show, so that if this production or a story of your own triggers something, that they can talk during intermission to a behavioral health specialist if a community member has something to say, or if something's been triggered. After the show, the behavioral health specialists are there. Most of the time they stay overnight. So there's support there. And then hopefully a week after we leave, the behavioral health specialists will come back and they'll start a community dialogue about each specific place, because it's different everywhere you go, because each community is different. So that's, that kind of ties into what Anne was saying and the importance of that. Going back kind of to what Annie was talking about is, in the village of Kivalina, we had a principal who wants to do a lesson plan based off of this play. And basically she wants to take, and this kind of goes back to being able to, with your own community, even in the lower 48, taking this production that's Alaska Native production, but taking it and having it resonate through your own community. She wanted to take the scene where Dwayne meets Sydney, and the kids have that scene. And then she wanted to only present the one more scene, and that was the scene where Shadow, or Dwayne, the 17-year-old who meets Sydney, has his final monologue about how he's made it, or is beginning to make it, and how he's changed. She wanted to take those two scenes and leave everything in between blank, and have each student write their own story on how they got from meeting this elder and how they got to the end, so that they can start crafting their own way and their own message and their own code to combating these harmful thoughts and these issues. So that's just one way too of thinking about storytelling and how it can directly relate to students and how their own lives can be put into this and how they can make a change.
Yes, did I see a hand up?
Well, I was just going to make a comment. I wasn't there in our community when Winterville was there, but I work as a mental health counselor and planner for our community, and so one of the things that happened as a result of the production at home is that it gave people the opportunity to talk about suicide in a safe way. I mean, we always feel like we need permission to talk to them about this part of everybody's brought up, we can't talk unless somebody gives us permission. But Winterville did that. It gave people one, permission to talk about it, and two, to talk about it in a way that they felt safe, and that it was okay to talk about it as well. Also, we talk about it when the death, so if you talk about it, sure, it wouldn't happen. And it's not just a myth, but it's also for us, planning. We talk about something before it happens, you're going to make it happen. So it did those two things. But the other thing I think that's more important, and he just talked about was using it in a school setting, but also one of the things that happened with us is that we're working toward this Children's Mental Health Day. So one of the things the kids are going to do is kind of do a digital storytelling, if and when we can figure out how to use it, use the iPads to do it about what children's mental health and wellness mean to people or to them. And so their task is to go around the community and either film something or interview an elder or somebody that would give their idea of what children think. So it opened up a lot of different ways of addressing the issue of not just suicide, but other difficult issues as well. Sexual abuse, that happen to people, and they never found their voice. And, it provided an opportunity to get that dialogue started. So So yeah, it was different about things international, but at the same time, it gave the opportunity for people to do it.
Thank you very much for sharing that.
Interesting things. Yeah.
So that is indeed the intent of the whole project, is to, we sweep in with our show and our workshops, and it's great and very enjoyable, but we're very aware that we also leave. And we worry about that, we really do. So we hope that the other shoe to drop is that people in the local community will be inspired to discover their own resources, their own strengths, their own powers, their own culture, their own performance traditions. As I said, we all have them, all of our tribes have them. They were suppressed, but we want to encourage those to come back. It's to encourage everyone to get their voice, to speak. Then we can get at the truth, and we can write a better ending. Who else? Does anyone else work in suicide prevention? Or you? A few hands? People work in the other kinds of abuses that feed into that. Sexual abuse, or a few hands going up here. Please, go ahead.
I was thinking that a question that comes up often is, well, how do you measure? And I always have trouble with that, because it's very hard to measure an impact of a performing arts kind of a piece. I know with regular suicide prevention, I shouldn't say it like this, but you have a workbook and you go through the chapter and you do chapter 1, and then there's an evaluation right then, and they ask you, does this make you more inclined to think about suicide? And so of course your answer is yes, because it's just right there. So we don't have that luxury, but I know this works. I can't prove it. We always do an evaluation and we get comments from people. But I guess I know it when we take it to places like McLaughlin Youth Detention Center here in Fairbanks. And when we did that in 2015, which South Central also sponsored, Tom Huntington, who's Annie's brother, lent us Sidney Huntington's own parka, which is an incredible piece of art made by Sidney's wife Angela, that it is 4 wolf skins sewn together with a huge ruff on it, and it's enormous and it's heavy, and I had to carry it a lot, so I know that. So at the end of the play, very close to the end, the animals give the boy their gifts, and the wolf gives this coat to Dwayne, the teenager, and puts it around his shoulders and says, "Take this, it's from me and Sydney." And it always gets a laugh because it's a wolf. But when the wolf put that coat on around the teenager's shoulders at the youth detention center, there was a gasp. It was, I'll never forget it. And to me, that's all the proof I need. And if I could have recorded that, maybe it would have been visible. But this is kind of something that we have to do with a project like this, is how do you get your grant money? Well, often you have to show them everything's evidence-based, so you have to show them how this works, etc. So we do testimonials, and we have on our website a documentary that we did in Ruby, which is a village on the Yukon, and it's people talking about what the play meant to them. So I think those kinds of things are our best proof, but it's interesting. It's interesting parameters that people put in front of us to hurdles we have to jump over. And,
2 brothers, 2 sisters, 2 cousins, the suicide. This last week in our community, there was another person that committed suicide.
sorry to hear about your losses.
MSPI is one of the programs that provides support to this. The other one is Garrett Lee Smith Suicide Prevention. So nonprofits, they do have resources. They just need to fashion a program or a project narrative that includes a gift to this nonprofit to present the winter bear in their community. The other one is to approach your corporation to see if they could partner with a nonprofit to provide funding. I know that up in the Northwest area, Nome area, they did some of that when Manila and Nana and Quark put money in. So kind of a partnership like that. And then communities have even raised money, a little bit of money to help support this. Any little bit helps. I mean, pay for the charter to get all the actors and the scenery, the stage stuff to the community. So there are ways to do it. Talk to your planner at your organization and see how that could happen. Because that's how we did it. We just mixed and matched funding from South Central and supported the winter bear that way.
Yeah, I should mention that communities provide a tremendous amount of in-kind donations too. The school districts allow us to stay at the school, so we can, we don't have to do lodging, because lodging in small Alaska villages, if it is available at all, is prohibitively expensive. They provide all the publicity. Often the school will pick us up and drop us off, and all kinds of factions within the community. The tribal councils provide support for us.
And do you guys have cards?
I don't have any cards with me, but if you look up our website, winterbearproject.com, also winterbearproject@gmail.com.
And on Facebook, the Winter Bears Project.
Yes, any of those. Please reach out. We will be happy to speak with you. Yes, I see a hand. We have probably time for one or two more.
Good afternoon. January 31, my heart goes out to you and your family. January 31 changed our village. Our nephew, my nephew had committed suicide. 16-year-old hunter, trapper, provided for his family. Then suddenly one day, took his own life. And I thank you for bringing this up here. I know all over the highest rate is suicide. We have this program in our village. I'm from Buckland, Alaska. And we have this program which was called suicide prevention. But we changed the title because we felt like it was, suicide was, some people don't like to hear that. We changed the title to Celebration of Life. And it's been 6 years since we started that. But it's really, I feel for you also, ma'am, for your brother. And even though it's a while back, it seems like it's still healing. And in our village, it's going to take a long time to heal. I get emotional at times when I think about it because he had a long life ahead of him. Nice young man. I mean, who would have thought? Because that day, I passed right by him. I was going with a Honda. And I passed by him. That thought stayed with me every day. I passed that same road. If I should have, what came to me, I should have stopped. I should have. I'm a leader in that village. I remember, council member, my wife's a teacher. Both of us are foster care parents, licensed, and it's real hard, to deal with this. And I like the theme here where communities get together, bring healing. It is time. It is time to start speaking out. I myself have to do that too. Because it's so hard to deal with every day. And I thank you all for being part of the panel. Thank you. God bless.
Oh, thank you. I'm afraid that we're about out of time, so I just want to end on a thank you to NICWA and my language for coming and hearing our example of how to help people tell their own stories. We hope that you will continue to do all the great work that you're doing and that you've learned some useful advice and inspiration on how to keep going and doing everything that you are doing. You guys are so important. Thank you.